Howdy, I'm Nolan Gray, Research Director for California EMB, where we're hard at work making California an affordable place to live, work, and raise a family. Welcome back to Abundance. In this episode, I talked to Sonia Hirt. Hirt is a professor of architecture and urban planning at the University of Georgia and the author of Zoned in the USA, really fantastic book. In this episode, we talk about the zoning reform push that's currently underway, how other countries do zoning in a different way, and what we still have to learn from Jane Jacobs. As always, on with the show. Cool. So, hi, Sonia Hirt. Thanks for joining.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
It's my pleasure. Zoned in the USA is still one of the top books that I recommend to people on zoning. Book that I read that actually made me realize that this could actually be a whole area where you do dedicated study. I mean, it's kind of remarkable, actually, when you think about it. I feel like you could probably get a planning degree in much of the U.S. and never actually take a class on zoning or even read a paper on zoning. And it's so central to what planners do in their day-to-day.
Well, in the United States, aside from capital investment, zoning is probably, and often capital investment doesn't come from the local level. In terms of local planning instruments, I think actually zoning is the most powerful instrument that planners have. And of course, not just zoning, land use, subdivision regulations, the other design guidelines and so forth. But I still think that zoning is the most powerful instrument we have, which is particular and peculiar and interesting if you've done comparative research, because I don't think that that's the case in a lot of other Western democracies. And you've, found some interesting things about Japan here in your book. We can talk about other countries as well, but I think I think even if you don't take a class, I think American planners are really expected to generally know how zoning works and what you can do with it. And so it's a very interesting question, in my opinion, as to why zoning is so important in the United States, but it's not as important in other countries. And I actually just wrote a book chapter about it. And it's like one of these basic questions. There must be an elephant in the room. And I don't think anyone ever actually gave the answer to this question.
So why zoning seems to be binding in the U.S. but not abroad?
Well, it's not that it's binding, but why is it such an important instrument in American planning, while it probably is not in most other Western democracies? Now, I have a kind of a provocative thesis on this subject. If you want, I'll tell you.
Oh, please.
Okay. So I think that this is the answer to the question. Why is zoning so important to American planning? So why is zoning such a strong instrument? The reason why zoning is so powerful in the United States is because planning is so weak. So here's what I'm trying to say. If you're in Helsinki or Stockholm, 90% of the land in these cities is owned by the municipality. They have so much greater powers to shape land development without zoning that why would they bother? But zoning is generally, just like you say in your book, is an instrument that's put together, Houston excluded by the public sector to regulate the activities of the private sector. But that's exactly the whole point, because the majority of land development in the United States happens by the private sector. What the public sector can do is simply regulate it. So it's reactive. Yeah, we are creating future land use maps. And yes, we're telling people they can or cannot do this on a piece of land in the future. But ultimately, the whole system works for the public sector to regulate the private sector, which does most of the development. But in other countries, a lot of the development is actually done by the public sector. So why would the public sector actually regulate itself? And this is an interesting connection. I don't know, I'm maybe a little bit on a limb here, of the question of what you mentioned, what's the experience of post-Soviet cities. So here's, I think, an interesting window into the subject of zoning. So when zoning was first proposed 100 years ago, and I'm sure you found this in my book, it was actually suspicion that it's a form of communism. Because it's such a, draconian public sector intervention into the activities of the private sector. It seemed un-American. But if that was the case, probably one could see what happened to zoning in Soviet Russia. they simply abolish the system. Because once they pass a decree in which urban land belongs to the state, why should the state regulate itself? So on the contrary, zoning is actually, it only works and is important in systems that really the private sector is the leader of the whole pack.
Mm.
So rather than it being a communist idea, it's as far away from communism as it possibly could be, because it's an acknowledgement that all the private sector can do is pass a few regulations on you, the private sector.
Mm. Yeah, that's a really fascinating distinction, right? So the American notion is, yes, capital is going to be private, the developer is going to be private. It's going to theoretically be based on what a market consumer would purchase. But then we're going to place 1,000 rules. We're going to torture that project to squeeze out a few affordable units, and that's how we're going to do our affordable housing policy. And all of our urban design is going to be done through this sort of intermediary of telling the private sector what to do. But in many other countries, it's just the public sector will just do a lot of these developments in the first place.
Right. So therefore, for them, zoning is just not really an important part of planning. It's much less important than it is here. So actually, the fact that zoning is also strong is a testament, in my opinion, that in the United States, the private sector really produces most of development, which I don't think anyone would disagree with. So I think that's a very basic hypothesis, and yet I actually have never seen it articulated.
No, that's really fascinating. This is, I think, partly what we really wanted to dive into is here. It's just also how different U.S. zoning is from zoning regimes abroad. There's a whole chapter of your book, Zone in the USA, is dedicated to this, and it's just really, really fascinating. But and you had a paper out too, specifically on Stuttgart, that I found really fascinating, where if you look at an American planner could crack open a German zoning code, right, and it would probably actually look broadly similar. Right, there would be residential zones and maybe certain other commercial or industrial use zones. But you kind of make the point in that paper, and then in a lot of your other work, that the U.S. zoning is actually quite different from how zoning works in most other countries. I don't know if you want to touch the high notes there.
A lot of countries don't even use the term zoning. Like if you go and ask people, well, which is what I did, and obviously I'm born abroad, so I had a lot of familiarity. That's why zoning was so interesting to me, because it was simply so different than what I expected America to be. But when but I lived here for a long time, 30 years now. And when I began doing this research, which was probably 10 or 15 years ago, my first idea, having been totally Americanized, is I'm going to go around in a few European countries and I'm going to ask to see their zoning ordinance. And like, what the hell is a zoning ordinance? So that's the difficulty of comparative research, that they might have different names for different things. The concepts are different. The context is different. So simply asking a question, you're getting this wall of dismay, in which they literally are not sure what are you asking, to the point where, if you say people, if you talk to people about, say, residential zones, the answer will be, well, our entire city is a residential zone because people live everywhere. What else is there to say? So the whole idea of actually having huge chunks of your town, which is common in the United States, colored in yellow, and this is your single family district, that simply is inconceivable to other people. So that's why comparative research is so difficult, because I think that we there's some basic misunderstandings. The concepts are different. The context is different. It's very difficult to do comparative research, which is, like you said, why there is so little. And what I find interesting, another interesting topic in this, in my opinion, is that I find American planners to be in a similar position to our predecessors 100 years ago, who were heavily studying how other people do it. But at the time, it seems like, well, but today the job should be much easier, right? Because I can Google Translate any document I want. Because I can travel more, so I don't have to take a ship to go to England. Or because, I can email to people. So we have all these instruments that are supposed to make our job easier, and yet we know so little. So it's another question. Why isn't it easier today than it was 100 years ago? And I have a thesis on that as well. I think at the time when zoning was first introduced to the United States, because the United States did not have a system like this, it was like tabula rasa. So whatever was, they were taking these mostly German instruments and translating them, and there was no way to confuse the foreign instrument with the domestic one because the domestic one didn't really exist.
Mm.
Now we have our own, and we filter what we're learning about our country, other countries, through what we know about our country, because it's our point of reference, which actually makes the comparisons almost more difficult.
Mm.
So I don't know whether we know more how other people do zoning today than did people 100 years ago about their contemporaries. And that is somewhat sad and unsatisfactory.
Right. Well, I mean, it's in a lot of your work too. There's usually a little section justifying comparative work, right? Because I think one reaction to even doing comparative zoning or land use work is to say, well, like countries are just too different, or the cultures, like, oh, Germany has a different zoning code because they have a different culture, and you just dismiss it, and we don't have anything to learn from each other. But actually, I mean, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
You're absolutely right. So actually, when I wrote my very first comparative article, which was published in 2007, I can't believe it's been 15 years. It might be the one that you're talking about, because I went to Stuttgart. And that was exactly what I had 4 reviewers. I'll never forget, because I was a junior faculty member, and I had these 4 reviewers for JAPA, the Journal of American Planning Association. And one was very negative. And it was all about it. This is just not, what is the relevance of this? What is the relevance, since we can never go German, and why should we? And how do you know it's even better? And I don't know that it's better. And as a matter of fact, when JAPA agreed to publish the article, the very senior faculty member, whose name I can't recall now, but back in the day, he had requested that he writes a response to my article, and actually raising these questions of whether comparative research is so important. So I was actually surprised at the time that the editor expected me to put a section on the importance of comparative research, because I thought that everyone would agree. Mm-hmm. I think there's another interesting historical evolution that.
Well, it's just another quick comment on it. It's funny because when I first read the paper, I thought this is kind of a weird, like, I thought it was a weird section in the paper, because to me, I was like, well, like, of course, like, comparative work is intrinsically valuable. Like, why is Hirt spending all of this time justifying the project? So that explains it, right?
It's not going to get published without it.
Uh-huh.
Very clear point. So this is a good sign of the times, I think. And again, this was 15 years ago. I think there is today much more interest in this. But again, another point that I don't think it's a lot talked about, but it's another elephant in the room. So 100 years ago, there was this massive movement among American housing reformers, planners, and lawyers to study from other countries. And yes, they were only studying Europe. That is true. But I think what happens is that, especially with Victor in World War II, American planning, potentially like other professions, just stopped being interested in learning. Because we are the world superpower. What works here is here. Mm-hmm. We might be exceptional in many ways. That could be good or bad, but maybe in zoning too. So what is the point of these comparisons? Remember, when you have a debate about something else, healthcare system, and you would never find an article that says, well, let's do it because the French do it. It's just not sufficient in the United States, because the United States is its own planet. So it doesn't necessarily need to learn from elsewhere. But I'm kind of hopeful, because I think you can learn from anywhere. That I think this moment of, supremacy geopolitical is passing, which reflects itself in a million ways, but one of the ways is that I think that we are becoming more interested in how other people do it. Because I think, again, we are more open to learning today that we were at the time when Francis Fukuyama wrote that this is the end of history. If this is the end of history, why should I bother? But if it isn't the end of history, then there is something to learn. And so I think that there is a little, the circle has come around, and we are more interested in comparative work. But I think, in the 70s, in the 80s, and in the 60s, I think there was less of it. And also, specifically, the history of American zoning, I make this point in the book and in other places, that really about the year 1930, it really becomes American. Now it's a separate system. They've learned what they could. They set the system. This is how it's done. And so this is exactly the mid-century when I think American planners simply lost interest in other countries. You can open the plan of Chicago from 1909. This has no bearing on zoning, okay? Because they didn't have zoning in Chicago at the time. If you open the plan just for fun, you will see that half of the plan is renderings of cities around the world.
Mm.
You know, they got they got the Taj Mahal for all, you know, I mean, all kinds of places. Like, there was like, oh, let's see what they've done. Let's see what they've done. And you can't find an American plan from the year 2020 in which there is such an overrepresentation of how others do it. Because I think now we've become confident that this is our system. We know our system. It works for us. And so interesting foreign comparisons is simply lower. It's higher today than it was in 1980, but I still think it's lower than it was 100 years ago, because back in the day, the year 1909, I mean, America was still coming up on the horizon as a global power.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's kind of the history of American planning and our interest in other countries actually sort of parallels America's history in general, which is not shocking.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, so hopefully I think you're right that we're returning to a renewed interest in comparative studies. I mean, it was, you might have heard about this when DOT recently announced that they were going to launch a program teaching the rest of the world how to do transportation planning. And of course, the reaction from folks on Twitter was like, we're the most inefficient transportation builder in the world. And most of our cities have extremely, rudimentary transportation infrastructure relative to other developed countries. But of course, that's I think a legacy of that whole ethos of, yes, like we're the policy exporter. And I mean, you find that I think even within the US, when I was working as a planner in New York City, there was very much this notion of like, well, like maybe we can learn from London, maybe we can learn a little bit from Paris, but we can't learn anything from Jersey City. We can't learn anything from Los Angeles, even within the same country where like the zoning systems are broadly similar, right?
Very similar, yes. Which is another very interesting and kind of seems paradoxical thing, because in the United States, unlike most other Western democracy, there is actually not a state level zoning categorization system. So we come up with the system ourselves, city by city, and yet there is so much borrowing that at the end of the day, the systems are shockingly similar.
What do you think explains that? Is that just professional organizations, consultants copying and pasting?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what it is. I think that's exactly what it is. Of course, there is some variation, but it isn't. I mean, you don't find an American city that is like Stuttgart or some other place. Still there is a sort of a American cities coalesce, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we have a constitution that might be different than other countries. So, we have to, be in compliance with, precedent and the constitution and so forth. And these are unique things to the American system. So it's not shocking that we are different. I just think, again, like you were saying, I mean, the question is if we are different, and I think we are. I mean, is there a point of learning? Is there a point of actually the comparison? In my mind, the best answer to this question is by this guy. What was his name? He was a Harvard Law professor, Charles Haar. And he said that the whole point of comparative policy research is not necessarily that you can or should advocate the transferring of best practices or the elimination of worst practices, but rather simply that you are inviting self-reflection. And I think that when you see a mechanism that you are accustomed with, and you've lived with it for, we've lived with this for 100 years, and in our professional lives, obviously not 100 years old, but, in our professional life, that's all we know. And certain things become so obvious and routine that they remain unquestioned. And I think the point of comparative research is not to import things necessarily, because I think it's very difficult. And we've learned this from the history of zoning. It's really difficult, and foreign instruments get domesticated. But the point still is that I think comparative research gives you these aha moments. I'm like, gee, I guess not everyone does it. That's just not obvious. And some things are not obvious. Like, you say the word residential. In American residential zoning, this generally means just residential. But you say the word residential in Germany, and they think bakeries and stuff. So the difference is so basic. And I don't think you know that there's nothing obvious, routine or unavoidable about having residential zoning unless you actually see how other people do it. A system has the capacity to put you in a box, in a conceptual box. And I think when you compare, you begin seeing that, all these aspects of your system are actually invented. And I can question them. And maybe there is a better way, and maybe there isn't a better way. Maybe you study all these other countries and say, you know what, none of these systems work. But if you do, that's actually a very reflective, thoughtful process of arriving to this conclusion. We can't learn from other countries. It's still much better than simply declaring it from the start and saying, I mean, I just won't even bother. I mean, you can reach the same conclusion that the system should stay as it is, but at least you bother to analyze it. So that's why, that's what has motivated me to say.
Well, and I think, I mean, that notion about inspiring some self-reflection, I think is a really, really good point. And I think partly what I think is fascinating about your book too, is it comes out in 2015. And I think it's right around this moment where actually a lot of these conversations about the form of American zoning were really starting. I mean, now I mentioned this in the book, and I'm sure you've had a similar experience where, there have been periods where zoning is this sort of wonky thing that everybody would prefer to politely ignore. Oh, it's a technical matter, or it's a matter for practitioners. But of course, now we're in this moment where there's a lot of zoning reform, and I think people are being very self-reflective about zoning. And I think something that's really valuable in your book is pointing out like this, what's a very unique feature of U.S. zoning, which is you are going to have huge chunks of the city that are limited to detached single-family homes. There's going to be no low-rise multifamily. There's going to be no commercial. And sort of pointing out, that's actually very, very weird in the international context, right? Like most countries don't have something like R1 zoning. And if they do, it's, I think like in Stuttgart, it was like 5% of like the city, very small, right?
Yeah. So this is this enormous difference that to me, when I wanted to write the book, it's like, and why has not anyone noticed that? It's so obvious and so big. And it's like, somehow under the radar. So yeah, that was my motivation. But I think I think you're very right that when I began working on the subject and when I first wrote the book, I was actually very worried that this book, I'm like, who the hell cares about zoning? I mean, it's like I have chosen, my husband is like, I mean, you have chosen the most obscure subject to all people, and you're actually going to make it into a book. You're going to designate 4 years of your life to actually put this together. I mean, isn't this a more interesting subject that people would rather more talk about? And so I took this almost as a challenge, like, let me take the most boring subject on earth and see what I can turn it into a book. And I think for me, why I found the book interesting is because, in my opinion, through the history of zoning, as to any policy, it's kind of a cultural history. And so, although the book is technically about zoning, honestly, it's really not. It's using zoning as a window to actually write the cultural history, and that's what kept me going when I was very concerned that no one's going to read it and no one's going to buy it, and we're going to make any splash and so forth and so forth. And you're very right. I think it was at the beginning of what now is a trend, to the point where now we're at the place where not only that it's now a hot topic, but rather there are way too many books about it, which I never thought would arrive. At this point, I mean, there is just another one that came by Bill Ellickson. What is it, Frozen Neighborhoods or something? So it's like, I mean, you didn't obviously start the trend, but somehow to my credit, I captured the trend when it was just beginning to grow. It's just sheer luck, but hey, I mean, take luck when you can. So that's what I think. You're very right that now interest is much greater. And the other reason why I wanted to write a book, which you probably found, because it's in the first paragraphs of the opening pages, is that, when you come from abroad, America projects its image of the country that is most friendly to property rights. But then zoning is so shockingly restrictive. I just could not figure this out. I just couldn't understand how on one side, there's this whole aura of, private property freedom. And on the other hand, zoning codes in the United States are so restrictive. So it was a paradox for me. And every person, has to discover America for themselves. So this was my discovery. I had to figure this out. How do you actually square the circle that on one side supposedly it's very pro-private sector, on the other hand, it's so restrictive, and hopefully, at least when I wrote the book, I felt that for myself, at least I found some way to address the paradox more than I did before I wrote the book. And of course, all of us write books just to learn. I mean, you write books to, there are only two ways that you can learn something. You either teach it or write about it.
No, I mean, I think I knew my views on zoning. I thought I knew my views on zoning going into writing Arbitrary Lines. And then when you're actually writing the book, you're like, oh, there's actually a lot here that I needed to think through.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
and when the book comes out, you're like, oh, actually, I still know all the places that I still need to think through.
I know.
Well, I mean, the cultural piece is really fascinating because I spoke with Alain Berthaud as part of this series, and that's a big theme in his book is you can't really understand land use patterns unless you understand culture. And you have this notion of spatial individualism. Do you want to maybe like define that or how you think about that?
Well, I think that spatial individualism is really a very important element in the American cultural tradition. And it reflects itself not only in buildings, but generally how we live. I mean, at the end of the day, what is the basic explanation why people, why people don't take the bus? Okay, maybe the buses are not very nice, and maybe they're inefficient, and maybe the investment is not sufficient. There's so many other things, but at the end of the day, most people prefer to have their private space. It could be in a car, you're not dependent on other people's schedule. You don't have to sit next to them. You don't have to listen to them. You can do this on an airplane, unless you buy your own airplane. But with a car, you can accomplish that. And I think there is really a greater dedication in the United States to actually lead as a family a private life. If I may paraphrase Louis Mumford said that, suburbia is a collective effort to lead a private life. Well, so is residential zoning. It's a collective effort to lead a private life. And I really do think that there is a cultural difference. And of course, that's very tricky because there are 330 million people in the United States, of which 50 million people, including myself, are born abroad. So how could there be an American culture if it's so dynamic? People cultivate. They maybe the first generation, you find these surprises. By the second generation, people have Americanized. And maybe we don't want to talk about it in the old melting pot scenario, but I think we do get cultivated and we develop these expectations of having our own home and, having our own car and so forth. And I think private space is really more important to Americans than it is, let's say, to the English, which, normally we think of ourselves as culturally aligned. And there isn't anything wrong in it to begin with. It's just that if you structure your cities to the point where 90% is, for one land use, then you get all kinds of other problems like traffic and, environmental problems and so forth. By itself, whether having a private space being so important is bad or good, let God judge. But I think there is a definite dedication to private space, which you don't necessarily see in other countries to that extent. And I'll give you a very small example. When I began writing, and I was back in my home in the old country, and I was noticing in one of these growing post-Soviet upscale suburbs that, are now everywhere. And it's like, okay, so these people bought somebody, built a hotel. And then first it was the hotel, and then there was single family homes around the hotel. And I actually interviewed this couple just informally out of curiosity, like, well, yeah, of course I want to be next to the hotel. What if Robert De Niro comes? I want to be the first to see it. So there is this like, I don't want to see what's happening. Whereas in the United States, if you build the hotel, people are like, no, I don't want to be with all that noise and traffic, even if it's Robert De Niro. And so it's just a different way how people expect to really exist in the city. Again, I'm not able to judge it, but I think it's different. And I've been asked this, so find the root of this. I don't know what's the root of this. If you want to go historically, I think the very first person who spoke about the importance of having detached homes surrounded by fields and yards in the American tradition is probably William Penn in 1681. That's the earliest quote. He obviously didn't really build the tradition, but at least he first said it. But why it is the way it is. I mean, these are some of the biggest questions in history, really. I mean, how do cultures develop?
Well, and I think,
Right, that's one start.
it's an interesting question. I think an element here is, right. It's not just that people have these preferences and that these preferences were realized in the development pattern, but that in many U.S. cities these preferences are written into law, right? So in many U.S. cities, like for example, I think what part of what's happening in the YIMBY moment is that maybe a lot of young professionals are realizing like, oh, there are not townhouses in walkable neighborhoods near parks, or you have baby boomers who are retiring and downsizing, and they're realizing, oh, there's actually not any condos in my city. Like there's only one mode of living that's really in any way sort of allowed by the current zoning.
So I totally agree. So, I mean, clearly, and that's the whole point. I mean, we are constrained by our institutions to an extent. And this is exactly, I think you're absolutely right. This is really what makes the American land use patterns different, because in all countries, there would be neighborhoods of single family homes because people want them, or developers build them that way, through other mechanisms, but they will not be mandated by law. And what really makes it different in the United States is that you have 90% of any large town, pretty much, not to mention 100% of most suburban areas, where it really is mandated by law. And I think it's a riddle that, it's one of those chicken and egg things. So which come first? I mean, so did culture come before the institutions, but then the institutions come to shape culture because it becomes an expectation. If my neighbors live in a single family home, I can be lesser. I should have mine as well. So, and I don't know, I personally lack the research expertise to determine whether culture comes before institutions. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like one of these, questions for the ages, right? I mean, it's like asking, is the political economy, primary to culture, or is it not? I mean, I don't know. I mean, they obviously dialectically relate to each other over time. So clearly our culture today is shaped by the institutions we live with, but I still think that at the very beginning, when they really departed from the German tradition and crafted American zoning to be exactly what it is, American zoning, I think there was a cultural element. I mean, the way that the Europeans were doing it was just not fit for American conditions. And so the system, because of this cultural the influence of this culture, which is dedicated more to private space, eventually influenced the system, the institutions, which of course only shape culture. And all this is, also combined with political economy and government, the role of government and so forth. So it's complicated. And like you just said, when you wrote the book, I mean, once you write something and you finish it, at that point of time, I begin to see how wrong I was when I wrote it. But what can you do, right? It's too late. It is what it is. It's gone through copy editing. You just have to send it. I think all of us in academia can make a whole career just disagreeing ourselves from 5 years ago. So just like you said, I mean, now I know so many things that are, I would say that I haven't found things that are really factually wrong with the book, but I feel like, I didn't give enough attention to this factor or didn't really think this through. And I think that's just all normal. I mean, that's, we grow, right? I mean, if you don't disagree with yourself, then you didn't learn anything through the process.
Well, what's the quote, right? A poem is never finished; it's just abandoned, right? I can't remember who said it. Well, I think before we move on to other topics here, I think another element that your book picks up on, the respect in which U.S. zoning is pretty weird, is the extent to which it's almost completely local. So you talk about this in the context of francophone systems or Germanic zoning systems. Higher level of governments play a pretty large role, and this is a conversation that we're having here in California and in states all across the country, where state governments are maybe playing a little bit more of an active role, saying, "Hey, we're going to legalize ADUs statewide," or "We're going to eliminate parking requirements statewide." And local governments are saying, "Hey, this is our exclusive power." But I think, as you notice, as you point out in the book, that's also pretty weird relative to a lot of our peers.
Yeah. And it is weird. I totally agree. And actually, that was my favorite article that came from the Los Angeles Times. It was a few years ago. That was finally that title that I always wanted to see, which was the whole point of my book. It's really weird. It doesn't mean it's bad. It's just different. In kind of human history or human geography today, it's really an aberration. And that's the whole point of comparative research, that this is what self-reflection is.
Hmm.
Because I think it's so easy to assume that it's normal, routine, and widespread because we do it. I mean, how else would you do it? Then it turns out, no, that's not the only way to do it. That's just one way to do it. And I think that you only get to this point, including the local stuff and, again, the dominance of the single family home, only comparatively. It's not possible to actually reach that newspaper title, blah, blah is weird, without actually having done comparative research. That was my whole point. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying it's different. And you may have not known how actually different it is from how, other people do it.
Right. Yeah. And I'm sure there's elements of the U.S. system that are weird for the better, of course. But I think
Absolutely,
sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, one thing I think, and I've never done any serious empirical research on this, but just anecdotally talking to people, I think one of the good elements of the American system is actually we have a higher level of participation, public participation, because it's so intensely local. People care. I mean, if you're going to be, in Istanbul, it's a city of 10 million people. What's your influence on the planning process? But this intense localization of how planning decisions are made actually is precisely what brings people to these public meetings. Maybe it leads to NIMBYism. Okay. But still, I mean, one would think that generally speaking, we planners think of public participation as a good thing. And I think that this extremely decentralized pattern that we have and the fact that these decisions really are made at the local level is one element that explains why people participate. So you can't really take the good without the bad or the bad without the good. So you just have to consider the pluses and the minuses of any system.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's very good. A robust involvement, certainly when you're doing things like comprehensive plans or general plans, I think is actually very valuable and unique. I think there's right when you have sort of ad hoc public hearings on individual projects, then I think things go a little bit off the rails. But that's an interesting point, that the unique feature is the participation. You mentioned the old country. You've done a lot of work on post-Soviet cities. What do you think? Right. So this is maybe I'm going to be reviewer number 3 here. What do Americans have to learn from the experience of post-Soviet cities?
Okay, well, it's very interesting. So I don't know where to start. So I think that although one can critique the Soviet system on 500 different levels, one of the positive things which capitalism did not help with is that there was a massive loss of green space. And the reason why it happened is because back in the day, that's probably a point of reflection for American planners. I mean, back in the day, the state was not all powerful, but more powerful. And because they controlled ownership of land, they could do things whatever they wanted. So actually, the Central and East European capitals had by far more green space per person than did West European capitals. So, I mean, the normal comparison is Budapest and Vienna, which in 1990, Budapest they were part of the same empire until 1918. Budapest had 4 times more green space per person than did Vienna, which is a shocking statistic. And so parks, I mean, because again, the state had this complete control through state intervention, they could do whatever they want to, including building the most magnificent parks to have existed, at least in terms of size. And so what happened with the collapse of the regimes is that all this land got privatized. And so cities lost some 30, 50, 70% of their open areas to development. And I mean, just imagine what would happen to Los Angeles if you just lose 50% of open green space. I mean, there will be like an outrage. So, I mean, there's some really negative elements about what happened, and it's not recoverable. I mean, it is recoverable. You can't convert, rails to trails and all that. But at the end of the day, losing such amount of open space because of the transitions was probably one of the worst things that did happen to cities. And it's, I mean, the lesson to American planners is enjoy while you have.
Well, I think another thing that you flag in this work that's interesting to me is the extremely high rate of owner occupancy after
Mm,
these regimes
yeah.
fall. I mean, that seems like the complete opposite of the previous system. What happened, and what have been the costs and benefits of that?
So actually, that's another very interesting point, and that's again why you need comparative research, because people make these assumptions. We go around and we say we are a nation of homeowners. That really was true until World War II.
Hmm.
If the statement "we are a nation of homeowners" is meaning taken comparatively, like, I mean, this has to mean we are a nation more of homeowners than other places, or otherwise it would mean nothing, right? I mean, that's the whole point of saying we are a nation of homeowners, is to distinguish us from all these other places. But actually, in the Soviet world, in some countries, there was a lot of variation in how, socialism got implemented. In some countries, including the old country, home ownership rates in 1981, 1989, so right before the end of the regimes, were at over 80%.
Hmm.
So communist Bulgaria was more of a home ownership society than the United States of America. Who would have ever thought? See, so again, we make these assumptions, we don't throw those things out, then it turns out that's not the case at all.
Hmm.
And if you take the United States today, and if you rank up all the, you put all the, and this is in the book, all the developed democracies, we're kind of in the middle. We're not any more homeowners than China.
Hmm.
I don't know, is China capitalist or communist? I mean, they got home ownership there over 90%.
Hmm.
And so it's just they don't own detached homes, they don't own apartments. But that is also home ownership. So I think that this is actually an excellent example of the importance of comparative research. So, it's very easy to drink the Kool-Aid and say, yeah, we're a society of homeowners. Well, I mean, it just ain't true. So, comparative research gives you these wake-up moments. Look at that. I go around and say that, then it's just not true. What is different about the American housing experience is really the ownership of detached homes. It's not ownership per se.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think as you are getting at here, right, like our notion of owner occupancy, we just immediately assume a detached single family home and not a condo or a co-op or any other type of arrangement.
Yeah. It's just an assumption. That's all it is. And that's why comparative research helps break the assumptions. You might still think that, okay, we do have the best system, maybe. But the point is like, oh, and now I know how my system is different.
Mm-hmm.
And there is no relationship between rates of home ownership and the way you zone, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Again, you can have very high home ownership without having any zoning or single family residential zoning. I mean, again, they would just own apartments. So,
Well, on the comparative point, I think maybe in the country like the U.S., there's a resistance to doing this type of work. But I've done research on land use planning in Latin America, and of course, like a lot of that, for example, in Central America, and very often, like same thing as you said for the Chicago plan, like huge sections of the documents are like, well, here are what these different countries do. In many cases, explicitly, citing countries that fund the planning work. I mean, now we have this international development model where a whole bunch of money to do planning work in the developing world is coming from the EU, for example, or USAID. And so there's this sort of funny thing where, a country like Guatemala is saying like, okay, here are all the lessons that we need to learn from Copenhagen, right? And then you're like, well, this was funded by, the Danish government or something like that, right? So like countries are doing comparative like work still, but maybe not in the most sort of robust way, and it's not maybe happening so much in the developed world, right?
well, I mean, I don't know anything about Guatemala, but I assume that they probably don't see themselves as exceptional the way we do. So they're still willing to learn in ways I think we really stopped for about 50 years. But again, I think we are now reversing some of this isolation that we really chose to live in because we just thought we are better. And again, like I'm not saying, I mean, maybe we are better. I just think it should be debated and not just stated.
Right. I feel like we could talk about the comparative stuff probably for hours. You've also done work on Jane Jacobs. Of course, I think most people, when they crack open like their first planning book, it's most likely going to be Death and Life. most people have read it. They probably move on from there. Why revisit Jane Jacobs?
Yeah. Well, so my explanation is going to be very disappointing because it's not so, like, how should I say, it's not really so thought out. I actually have trouble when people ask me why are you studying subjects that are so different? I mean, they simply don't make sense together. And I'm like, well, they make sense to me. So that's all I care about. So, when I first read Jane Jacobs, which must have been because she was actually not translated until relatively recently in the Soviet world, maybe 10 or 15 years ago. So the first time I actually read The Death and Life, I must have been a master's student, which puts it again, 1993, 94, 95, somewhere there. And I was fascinated, and I just made sort of a promise to myself that I'm going to do something about this. And even though it was not related to my other topics, I kind of promised to myself, and I just carried it through, although it was 10 or 20 years later. And so my fascination with Jane Jacobs, in which I try to, somewhat, articulate in the edited volume, just an edited volume, so I'll just call it a monograph, just an edited volume that I put together, is that I felt that when we read Jane Jacobs in architecture and planning school, which is the kind of school I went to, we don't really think about her influence on how we should design cities, or generally on the city. But my point is that, in my opinion, Jane Jacobs was, among other, she'd actually never saw, she wasn't educated, as you know, in planning or design or architecture. And she didn't see herself. I mean, she saw herself as a philosopher and as an economist. And I think there's something richer in what she was writing that's well beyond actually architecture, design, and planning. It's how we simply know the world around us. I think one of the most, the greatest contributions that she did was not to design and planning, whether you have super blocks or you do not have super blocks, but kind of reversing the very idea of how you actually know about the world around you. You can know about it by talking to regular people without statistics. Was in actually the 1960s, a shift in what was considered to be the proper way of knowing. And that is actually not about planning or architecture or cities. It's about ways of knowing. It's epistemology. Right. And so I thought because she's not nearly as well known in other disciplines, like, she considered herself home with the economists, but they never really took her. Strangely, only we took her as one of our own, although technically she's not really one of our own if she wasn't educated in the field. And so
there's a lot of sophisticated urban economics in Death and Life. I mean, concepts that were later sort of studied and confirmed by urban economists.
Stanford Together has a great book about her economic contributions. So definitely. But I think the way, at least I read the book, being in architecture and planning school, in my opinion, the read was always too narrow because it was focused on her contribution to architecture and planning. And I thought, somewhere deep inside, she was actually a philosopher. Mm-hmm. And we were kind of reducing this contribution by the nature of our beast, which is focused on, physical structure. So I just kind of had this, I just felt I owe her that.
Yeah.
I just owe her that. And so I told myself I'll do it. And although it took away from my main areas of exploration, I kind of felt strong enough about it as to actually carry it through. I mean, I don't expect to write another book about Jane Jacobs. So I don't consider her work as my main area, but I just had to do it for myself.
Yeah. Well, here's my much loved copy of Death and Life. No, I mean, I think I love your points on this, and I think many urban designers and planners read Jane Jacobs, and I think they actually focus a little bit too much on the dicta. I think they focus on kind of the unimportant stuff, right? Oh yes, the primary and secondary uses, that's I think still salient. Or they say Jane, Saint Jane said that 5-story heights is the most we ever need to do, and Saint Jane said you need old buildings around, and to my mind, those are interesting observations at the time and place that she's working, but those aren't really the important insights in her work. And the really important stuff is her theory about spontaneous emergent orders and how they work to perpetuate themselves and where they can go wrong. And she really gets into that. And like, I'm sure like systems of survival. This is another thing that, I think many people read Death and Life and then they are like, cool, I've read my Jacobs. That's all I need.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think systems of survival is probably some of her most impactful work.
I mean, so actually she did not, like many famous authors, I guess, whether they're musicians or artists, what was important to her is, she was surprised by the popularity of the Death and Life, and she didn't want to be known for that. She really believed that her greatest contribution are in urban economics. So I think it was a disappointment to her from what I've read, that this is what people associate her with. And I think you're very right. I think that people in our types of school, architecture and planning, we have the propensity to really take exactly the dicta. Oh, she said 5 stories. No, that's like in regards to her context. In another context, if you're in Singapore, that probably would not work. So I think that's exactly, you said it better than I did. By focusing on these very specific dicta, we were missing the complexity of her thought.
Right.
And I don't know that necessarily, I help the problem that much, because at the end of the day, most of the people who wrote for the book happen to be planners. It's defeating my purpose. Well, I have a couple of philosophers, thank God, and a couple of economists and political scientists and this and that. But again, I think my point was I wanted people to stop thinking about the small points, because her points were much bigger. So that's why I did it.
You have a new book in the works. Do you want to tease that a little bit?
Okay. Where do I start? So I'll start from the very beginning. So here is my title. My title is America's Hurry: Making Sense of Space and Time in My Adopted Country. So I think, again, in architecture and planning schools, we consider our disciplines more or less spatial. We talk about space a lot. If I have to count the number of conferences in which panels are about space, it's massive. But very rarely we think about time. I mean, obviously, space and time cannot be separated, and you don't have to be a physicist or a philosopher. That every aspect of our work has a temporal element to it. And the most simple example that I give in class is, okay, so you say, I'm going to a park. I have to look for a parking space. I found a parking space. So I'm going to rent that space. If you're renting the space, why does the parking meter measure time? So you can never really, time and space, they cannot be separated. And I think that we have not really thought in our professions so thoroughly about time as we have about space. So the purpose of my book is actually, I make a claim, here's my claim, which is in one sentence, that we Americans live space rich and time poor. We take more space than other cultures, and yet we live apparently, and there is empirical evidence about this, really faster. We sit at the table, we spend less time, we take fewer vacations. We don't take a month-long vacation. We prefer to break it in some long weekends. So my point is that there could be, a lot has been written about an American ideology of space, and I'm obviously quoting Leo Marx from 1991, but less has been written about an American ideology of time. But what if it's really just as important? And how did these ideas about long space and short time actually emerge? So the way I said is like, of space for Americans, more is more, but the time, less is more. Is this logical, or is it actually contradictory? And I don't know. That's why I decided to write the book. So I actually, probably because I'm so interested in just learning about the United States and still trying to make sense of it, I actually am going to a lot of the correspondence of the founding fathers. These guys were great philosophers. And if you reread their stuff, if you read de Tocqueville, there's all kinds of quotations about time and space. We just don't read these materials with this method in mind. And so So that's my charge. And I'm only on chapter 3. So I haven't gotten that far. But the point is, like, I'm really curious whether there is an American ideal of space, as there is there also one of time, and how they actually developed. And so the logical questions here is, what does this have to do with urban planning? And so in my last chapter, which is called Intersections, that I'm going to eventually figure out the way they intersect. And I feel very bad about saying this, because I never really know what I'm going to write about until I begin writing. And I felt very bad about this for a long time, until I read an interview with Jane Jacobs, bringing us back to the point where she said that she never knows what she's going to write about until she writes. So after that, I feel so much better about myself. So that'll be my next project. I'm also working on a textbook, which somehow I agreed to do. But so I have these 2 books in parallel, and one from the brain, and the other one from the heart.
And the textbook, what is the textbook going to cover?
So it's contemporary urban planning. It's a very very well used textbook that's gone to 11 editions by John Levy. I don't know whether you've used it in your classes. So that will be the 12th edition. And then John Levy's he's a wonderful guy, but he's at an age where he's not going to write it. So he asked me whether, and we have a contributor I also have a co-author from the University of Maryland, Casey Dawkins. So the 3 of us are hoping to actually, put the 12th edition. And it's not about hoping, because we're under contract, so we can't do it. This has to come out this summer. The manuscript has to be sent this summer. And once I'm kind of done with that, I'm going to go back more to America's Third. But I'm having a really great time with it, because again, imagine how much information you have about American history just from growing up in the United States, going to high school. Well, I'm missing all these things. So for me, this is a great opportunity to discover. And just to give you an example, so it's not super abstract. One of the greatest inventions that I think America brought to the world is Benjamin Franklin's "time is money." Everyone uses that. Maybe it's a terrible thing to say, and maybe it set us on a path that is self-defeating and we're always busy, but the fact it was still an invention. And we don't think of this and how it reflects on what we do today. So that's just another that's another discovery for me. It kind of makes sense. It probably will make more sense once I'm done.
Well, I look forward to diving into it.
Right.
Yeah, well, hopefully we'll have a conversation about that at some point soon.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm
well, thanks again for joining. Your work has been really influential on mine, and I think it's played no small role in hopefully stimulating some self-reflection on the way we plan cities. And I look forward to your future work continuing to do that.